Do we need regular water changes in our fish tanks? This topic has been increasingly popular in recent times after a number of videos released by some popular YouTubers, such as, for example, Fatherfish. And the argument has been that you should not change water in your fish tank as long as you have a certain set of conditions in your fish tank, which is thick layer of substrate with sort of natural soil, lots of live plants, and very few fish in it, so-called Volstat method. We'll get back to the Volstat method in a moment, so I'll take out my Diane Volstat book and have a look at it. What does she say about doing water changes? But before that, I will talk about the things that I want to discuss in this video. So, should we do regular water changes in the tanks that Fatherfish talks about? Well, there have been quite a lot of videos released by other YouTubers who discuss about the importance of doing water changes in tanks without plants, in tanks with cichlids, and in tanks with, for example, discus fish and larger fish. Obviously, you need to do water changes in this kind of tanks because there are no plants, there's nothing to deal with your nitrates, and you can't get away without water changes. But what about tanks like this one? This is my tropical riparium. It only has some small fish in it. There are some small tetras, pencil fish, some small corridors. So the largest fish here is smaller than 2 inches. It's smaller than 5 centimeters. So all of these fish, they're tiny. There's not too many of them. There are actually, well, I don't know how many, but you can see there is not too many of them. There are tons of plants. Not so many underwater plants. Yeah, there are some floating plants in here, like water lettuce, and there's some moss growing over there. But most of the plants here are riparian plants, and there's massive amount of riparian plants. There's a lot of them, and you can assume that they consume much more ammonia and nitrates than any of the aquatic plants. Just look at the size of this peace lilies. Look at the size of this monstera and those um, pothos plants. So they are extremely nutrient hungry and they consume everything out of this water column. I actually fertilize this tank quite a lot because otherwise there will not be enough nutrition for these plants. There's obviously zero ammonia, zero nitrite, zero everything in this tank because there's no chance for any nutrients to survive in this tank. Do I do water changes on this tank? Yes, I do, actually. Not every week. I'm trying to do it once in 2 weeks, but normally once in 3 weeks. But in any case, this tank does not stay without water changes for more than 2 weeks or 3 weeks for a number of reasons. As fish keepers, as people who keep just regular tropical tanks, not reef tanks, not aquascapes, we usually test for a few things. This is, for example, my water test kit. I'm not advertising it, but I just want to show you what it contains, what I'm testing for. That's ammonia, that's nitrite, nitrate, pH, GH, KH. And that's what most of us are testing for. We don't really test for phosphates, we don't really test for irons and other chemical substances which are present in the tap water. And obviously, we know what's happened here in terms of nitrates, nitrites, water hardness, ammonium, and so on, but we don't really know what else is happening here because we don't really test for it. And I don't really test for phosphates, for example, or for irons and other chemicals. I don't know what's happening here. And one thing that is likely to happen in a closed system like this is that old water is an extremely unpredictable substance. Anyone who knows anything about water chemistry will confirm that a water that doesn't get regular changes and it doesn't sort of get updated like your computer software, it's hardly unpredictable. We don't really know when, for example, phosphates will spike in here, when different metals will spike in here, because we don't test for them. And when we do water changes, we kind of renew the water parameters because we add water with established parameters. We know what's in that water that we add to our fish tank because it's either our tap water, it's a reverse osmosis water, and we know its chemical contents more or less. This is a spreadsheet that my water supply company provides on the contents, on chemical contents of our water. I'm sure you can find something similar in the places where you live, because most water supply companies, they are required to provide this kind of information to the public. So you can see that there's not just ammonium in that water. There are lots of different other things like iron, manganese, lots of bacteria contents, and conductivity. Yes, that's an important factor, but also lots of other substances. For example, sulfate, sodium, nitrite, and nitrate. Of course, we've talked about it. Copper, fluoride, arsenic, cyanide, and lots of other things. So all of these things, they're being tested by the water company, and we know that this is their actual content. When all of these substances stay in our fish tank for a certain period of time, they're likely to shift because of a number of variables, number of environmental conditions in our fish tank. For example, the content of copper, or let's say sodium or sulfate, is likely to either increase or decrease because of certain processes occurring as part of nitrogen cycle in our fish tanks. We don't really know about that if we don't test for them, and obviously testing for all of these parameters is very difficult unless you work for a water supply company. So the best way to control for all of these things in our fish tank is to regularly change water, which means that adding the water with established parameters. These are the established parameters, and this is what I want to have in my fish tank. I want to know that more or less these conditions are observed in my fish tank. I don't want to have unpredictable parameters, unpredictable amounts of, let's say, sodium or sulfate or fluoride or phosphate. I want to have these things under control, and that's why I do regular water changes on all of my tanks, regardless of whether they have high levels of ammonium or high levels of nitrate. Obviously, they don't, but nevertheless, it's not the only parameters that I care about. I care about a lot of other parameters that are, for example, in this table, and I want to make sure that the parameters of all of these chemicals, irons, and bacteria are more or less similar in my tanks to what they are in the tap water. Long story short, I do regular water changes on my tanks, not only because I care about ammonium nitrite and nitrate, but I care about the environment itself. I want to make sure that this is a healthy environment for my fish. And old water, the water that hasn't been changed for a long period of time, is a very unpredictable environment, and I don't want to deal with this. And the fish, they respond quite well to water changes, actually. I noticed that when I don't do water changes for like 3 weeks on this tank, I would normally lose one or two pencil fish and maybe one cardinal tetra. They're perfectly healthy. The water parameters are great, but for some reason, they generally don't like old aged water. And some of them, maybe weaker fish, maybe older fish, they don't make it through. So that's why I have to do water changes eventually, even though the parameters are perfectly. I have to renew this environment and make it more healthy for them, because the immune systems, they respond to more positive environment, more positive conditions. Let's look at another example. Apologies for all this mess. We're moving houses, that's why there are all these boxes, and I will make a separate video about how we will move all these tanks. But yeah, this is my other tank, which is also riparium. Lots of plants. You can see this enormous fern. It's actually kind of falling out of this tank. It's a huge fern. There's lots of other riparian plants in here. Very few small tetras. There's like 10 black neon tetras, 3 sorpa tetras, a few blood glass fin tetras, and that's it, actually. This tank doesn't have a heavy bioload at all. But every time when I don't change water here for more than 2 weeks, water gets yellow. You can see it's yellow now. It's been 2 weeks and it's time to do a water change. Water parameters are perfect, but All of these plants, they certainly consume nutrients from the water column, but what they also do, well, there is quite a lot of decaying roots, there is quite a lot of decaying leaves on these plants. You can see that there's quite a bit of old fern leaves in here, and they all eventually fall into the fish tank, and they all apparently affect water clarity or water cleanliness, not necessarily water parameters, but they affect the color of the water. And obviously water change is necessary despite all of these plants. After I'll change the water, which you're going to see in a moment, the water will be clear. It's not no longer going to be yellow. Obviously, this is not a Volstat tank because it doesn't have a dirted bottom, it doesn't have aquatic plants, it has lots of riparian plants, so it's a slightly different sink here. So what about the Volstat method, which is so much talked about on YouTube these days? Let's have a look at what Diane Volstat has to say about water changes. So that's a book that everyone talks about, Diana Volstadt, Ecology of the Planted Aquarium. And I've checked in advance where does she talk about water changes. It's actually at the very end of the book. Yeah, here it is. Actually, she doesn't talk much about water changes, but you can see what she says here. Frequent water changes should be unnecessary in well-established tanks. I change about 25 to 50% of the water every 3 to 6 months. So she doesn't say that water changes are not needed at all. She says that you should not do frequent water changes, but you still have to do water changes. And it's also important to consider what kind of fish tanks Diane Volstadt is talking about. Actually, there are some photos of her fish tanks here. You can see that a few guppies, lots of plants. A few blue spotted sunfish, lots of plants. The same here, no fish, lots of plants, a few juvenile cichlids and lots of plants. And this is also one of the examples of her fish tank, just literally a few rainbow fish, again, lots of plants. If you have the same type of tank with a few fish, lots of plants, that's when this method is going to work. If you have less plants, more fish, obviously more water changes. So to summarize, if you have a fish tank with a few small fish in it, lots of plants, probably you could get away without regular water changes. By regular, I mean weekly water changes. But if you never change water in this tank, you are taking enormous risks because you don't really know what's happening in terms of water chemistry in this fish tank. Your test kit is only going to show you ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, water hardness. That's it. You don't know about any other chemicals in this water in your fish tank. So you don't know what's going to happen to your fish because this becomes in highly unstable and highly volatile environments with also very fragile environments where anything can happen any moment, and we have very little control over what's happening there. Water changes provide us with this element of control when we can actually know what's happening in our fish tank, and we can actually more or less control the situation in our fish tank. That's why I'm a big supporter of regular water changes, regardless of whether you have perfect parameters in your fish tank or not, regardless of whether you have lots of plants in your fish tank or not, or whether you have few fish or not. So water changes is a tool that we as a fish keepers, as hobbyists, have at our disposal in order to control this tiny little environment and in order to make sure that these environments provide the perfect living conditions for our fish.